He was dancing. He was gasping for breath. But the applause continued, becoming louder.
Танцуй, Никита.
His heart was in his mouth. The future leader of the powerful nation, Nikita Khrushchev, performed his play. He was dancing hopak at Comrade Stalin's command. Having lost his strength, he sat down on a chair and felt something soft and wet burst under him. Beria had placed a tomato under him. The audience burst out laughing. A few years later, everyone was dead. The lucky ones died of natural causes. Some were executed. This funny and absurd little man, Stalin's misunderstood court jester, Nikita Khrushchev, took care of it. For 20 years, the Kremlin's fool concealed himself behind the fool's mask. He fawned and abased himself, all for the one cause: to survive, to come to the superpower, and at last to take vengeance on his bitter enemy, Stalin. The personal tragedy of the funniest General Secretary of the USSR. What led to Nikita Khrushchev's murderous deeds? And what was the sin against the Kremlin's fool, for which Stalin had to pay with his life? (1921) Donetsk. He is happy. He is racing to get home to see his wife and embrace his children. They haven't seen each other for 3 years. Throughout this time, at the front of the Civil War, he thought about them. Dear Frosya is a treasure, the only woman who could properly understand, protect, and give him support. And she gave him the most precious gift of all: faith in himself that Khrushchev had needed since he was a child. 1902, village of Kalinovka. That day, Nikita failed to get to school. The classmates formed a circle around him. They were pulling his clothes and laughing. They repeated this bullying almost every day. The boy's family was starving, which is why he had to go to school in cast-offs. He was ashamed and tried to keep away from the other children. But his silence only excited the young bullies. Nikita kept silent, lowering his eyes, but the classmates still mocked him. He didn't see the faces of his torturers, didn't hear them laugh. All he wanted was for it to stop. He slowly raised his head. The laughing stopped. Nikita waved his hands and sang out at the top of his voice. There was such resoluteness in his movements and voice that the classmates were mesmerized. When he stopped singing, they cheered, "Artist!" He was dumbfounded. It turned out that the best way to deflect their bullying was to act the fool. For years, though, he remembered the bitter taste of humiliation and became more unsociable and unapproachable until he met Frosya. She was sincere and trustful and without malice. Under her influence, Nikita's damaged soul gradually melted. They were in love and were soon married. Frossia supported everything he did. And Nikita tried hard to make his beloved wife proud of him. He got a job in the plant and worked hard. He even joined the Bolsheviks party. But he sidelined party affairs and a social life in favor of a cozy home life. He looked into Frossia's loving eyes and at his cheerful children and felt so happy. Soon, he would embrace them all. He kicked at the door with all his strength. Gloomy and foreign faces, a silence that could kill, a coffin, strangers, his children in tears. No, it's impossible. He threw himself on the coffin. He embraced the cold body and burst into tears. Frossia, why? He didn't notice his scared children trying desperately to snuggle up to him. He didn't hear the neighbors telling him about the terrible typhoid epidemic that claimed thousands of lives, including his Frossia. There was only one thing on his mind: how to live without her. He felt defeated and depressed. His dreams and his plans for the future no longer mattered, as he had lost the most important person in the world.
Не найдя жены в живых, он испытал не просто глубочайшее разочарование, глубочайший надлом. Он потерял единственную семью. Если бы жена осталась бы жива, Хрущев никогда не сделал бы не то, что государственной карьеры. Он никогда не был бы даже секретарем райкома, по сути. Ну, потому что он получил бы сразу, вот, знаете, такую свою крестьянскую мечту и остался бы в своей крестьянской эманации, в крестьянской сути.
After his wife's death, he couldn't stay in their house. He took the children and moved to a small apartment. He broke all communications with the outside. It seemed that nothing could bring him back to life. Until one day, there was a knock at his door. The young party instructor, Nina Khrushchev, decided to inquire why the Comrade Khrushchev had been ignoring party meetings for the last year. Is this proper behavior for a Bolshevik? Nina was surprised by his droopy shoulders, pale face and piercing eyes. He had the look of a wounded animal. Nina heard about the tragedy that had happened in the Khrushchev's home 1 year earlier. But she couldn't believe that Nikita had taken the loss so badly. After that, she visited him often, looking after him and his children. Nina Khrushchev became Khrushchev's trusty helpmate for the rest of his life. Although they weren't married, they lived together in a common law marriage for over 50 years. He never loved her, but treated her with respect and gratitude. She took care of the housekeeping and his children, and inspired Khrushchev to make a career in the party. He was rarely at home and devoted less attention to his children. He even tried to avoid them. The children bore a strong resemblance to Frossia. He grieved for them. It took time for the wounds of loss to heal. The children needed their father's attention, but Nikita tried not to think about it. Meanwhile, his elder son, Leonya, was terribly jealous of his stepmother. He infuriated Nina with his behavior, trying to attract his father's attention. Some years later, Khrushchev felt incredibly sorry that he had ignored his son.
Отказавшись во многом от теплого отцовского отношения с сыном Леонидом, Хрущев постоянно пытался найти себе других сыновей. Он был очень склонен к фаворитизму. Он постоянно пытался найти себе молодых подвижников, где бы он бы ни работал. Вся его история – это поиск семьи, поиск смысла, поиск сына и постоянное разочарование. А если Хрущев не мог найти себе вот опору в каком-то конкретном, он находил ее себе в массовом таком, в массовой семье.
1928, Yuzovka. He just breezed in. His wild eyes swept past a surprised Nina, who had met him on the threshold. Without saying a word, he ran to the kitchen and drank half a bottle of vodka. He poured the remains over his face and down his clothes. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Young men in mufti were looking for Nikita Khrushchev. Nina had no time to say anything before her husband burst into the living room. He was too weak to stand and was laughing and hiccuping loudly. Seeing the strangers, Khrushchev brightened up even more. He offered them drinks and then started an indecent chastushka with a stupid voice. Nina snapped her fingers. She had never seen Nikita so drunk before. The strangers had a laugh and left. When the door closed behind them, Khrushchev sighed with relief and fell on the sofa, drained of all his strength. It was the end of the 20th year. Lenin's former comrades created a tough opposition to the power of the newly made General Secretary Stalin. And under the leader's order, the security service employees started to look for enemies in the party. The actual Donetsk didn't escape the purges, at that time the town of Yuzovka. In 1928, at a meeting of the local party activists, all the participants were arrested on suspicion of conspiracy against Stalin. It's quite possible that Khrushchev knew something. Maybe somebody told him about the plans of the security service, but he didn't attend that meeting and had put on the drunken act at home. This funny undertaking saved Khrushchev's life. He was so convincing as a drunken fool that the young men in mufti didn't suspect anything. Khrushchev played the fool again, convinced that he'd found a great disguise. The more he played the fool, the more he moved up the party ladder, edging ever closer to Stalin. But then the time came when he had to wear this fool's mask as his true face. It became his curse. 1930, Moscow. They studied together at Moscow Industrial Academy. Nikita, attentive and polite, saw Nadezhda home again and again. He always tried to be beside this modest and silent girl because he knew that she was the wife of the Comrade Stalin. Khrushchev didn't give anything away, but he took the opportunity to praise the leader's party policy before Nadezhda. Above all, this modest party organizer wanted to be observed, and if he was lucky, he wanted to be signed.
Давайте вместе пообедаем, я вас с мужем познакомлю.
His heart leapt. This was it. After having some doubts, he expressed thanks to them for his invitation. The Kremlin's corridors were safeguarded. Nadezhda opened the door with her own key.
Tatka, это ты?
Tatka. This was the name Stalin gave to his wife when they were at home. He heard about a prospective party member, Khrushchev, from Nadezhda, and also from his faithful assistant Kaganovich. It was the beginning of the 30th year. The old party members, Leninists, headed by Trotsky, created a tough opposition, and the position of the General Secretary became increasingly precarious. He needed devoted people, and Stalin gave heed to Khrushchev. Stalin laughed and made fun at the table. While pouring wine, he entertained with the finest Georgian dishes. The emotionally strained Khrushchev felt weak.
Ну, Никитка, попробуй наши сетеви.
Так это курица. А у нас в Юзанке вот курицу не готовят. У нас петуха, значит, берут к нему лучка, как говорится, режут петуха, это, значит, лука там, перчика, вот, перчика всякого, чесночка. Ну, то есть, супер.
Khrushchev swapped recipes. Stalin kept a close watch on his guests.
Khrushchev был, на этот случай, первый. Это послушный исполнитель. Абсолютно надежный послушный исполнитель. И, во-вторых, Сталину импонировала та народность и тот, я бы сказал, та непосредственность, с которой Хрущев общался с массами. То есть как руководитель, при всей своей и невысокой образованности, и, может быть, недостаточно широком кругозоре, Хрущев вместе с тем воплощал в себе, ну, я бы сказал, такие лучшие черты народного характера. Не лез за словом в карман, всегда умел отшутиться, всегда умел как-то ярко и образно подать, порой достаточно сложные там какие-то партийные построения.
After the first meeting with Stalin, Khrushchev quickly advanced up the ladder, soon becoming the leader of the district committee of party. Over the years, he went on to become the head of the whole party organization in Moscow. It was a meteoric rise. But the higher he rose, the higher the price of his success. He called on his assistant and close friend, Boris Trivas. The room was a mess, papers and letters thrown about, and three men were examining a document.
О, товарищ Хрущев. Отлично. Подпишите, пожалуйста. Вот здесь.
He pretended to examine the document. Trivas looked at him appealingly. The enemy of the people. Should he sign it? Khrushchev knew Trivas respected him. What sort of an enemy was he? What if he didn't sign it? They would be accomplices. Khrushchev was terrified. He closed his eyes and signed the document.
Сталин подбирал людей, где было за что зацепиться в биографии, понимая, что манипулировать ими легче. И уж они-то будут работать не на страх, а, так сказать, ну, и за страх, и за совесть.
Khrushchev was walking down the prison corridor. He was the secretary of the district committee and was in charge of personally inspecting the actions of the investigatory powers. Somebody called him. He looked closely at the heavily bearded prisoner. It was Boris Trivas. Khrushchev was terrified and quickened his step. Shouts rang out behind him. Khrushchev felt sick. What was he guilty of? Why must he bear such humiliations? There was only one thing to do: forget about it. As time passed, he grew accustomed to signing the lists of the victims of political repression without hesitation. And he consoled himself again and again. Soon, all the enemies would be exterminated, and all his troubles would soon be over. He decided not to risk his position. Because the higher party gave him benefits he could never have dreamed of. But he felt guilty being part of the high-ranking apartment. This is the famous house on the riverfront. Right here, the Khrushchevs settled down in a 4-room apartment. It's a real Soviet paradise. It had an oak parquet floor, marble bathrooms, and ceilings painted by artists from the Hermitage Museum. It also had a clinic, a cinema, and a kindergarten. The inhabitants ate in the dining hall free of charge. They could pay with special coupons. If there was communism in the Soviet Union, it existed here. Khrushchev thought that his life was in good shape. The housekeeping and the children were in Nina's safe hands. He was in a good professional standing with excellent prospects. So the criminal case that landed on his table, addressed to Nikita Khrushchev, came out of the blue. A band of robbers were arrested. And this band includes Leonid Khrushchev, his son. His blood ran cold. They could report this to Stalin, and it would be the end of his career. Khrushchev decided to confess and promise his deep devotion to the leader. He entered Stalin's office. The leader looked at him. Nikita Khrushchev understood that the case was already reported to him. He didn't know what to say. The silence was deafening. And suddenly, Stalin, by accident or not, dropped his papers. Nikita blushed. His head was ringing. He threw himself at the leader's legs, picked up the papers, and handed them over. Stalin looked at him. Nikita felt that the tension in the office was lifted. The master had forgiven him. Nothing threatens Nikita. Leaving the office, he looked in the mirror and saw the fool's smiling face with spaniel eyes. He didn't even think of his son. Nikita Khrushchev will never forget that visit to the leader. Feelings of weakness rose again. He will always be afraid of Stalin and hate him for that fear. For that nasty tinge of humiliation and necessity to always play the fool. If only he could survive and not lose what he already had. He failed to close his son's case. But the hearings were held behind closed doors. The members of the band received the ultimate penalty: execution. Leonid was involved in this case as a witness. But Stalin decided that Khrushchev should not be allowed to get away with this. In a few months, Khrushchev got the position of the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine. Anyone would consider this a real gift. But Nikita Khrushchev understood that he was exiled from the Kremlin. It was a bad omen. When leaving for Kiev, Khrushchev was determined to win back Stalin's favor at any cost. And with this in mind, he flooded the Ukraine with blood. For the next 11 years, he remained in the Ukraine. There, Khrushchev learned to dance with his famous hopak, to sing the Ukrainian folk songs in a terrible mixed Russian-Ukrainian dialect, and to kill millions of people. Being away from Moscow, he showed his true nature, and that terrified the whole country. After Khrushchev's arrival in Kiev, the following encoded text was sent to the Politburo of the Central Committee in Moscow. Dear Losif Vissarionovich, every month the Ukraine suffers from 17 to 18,000 victims of the political repression. But Moscow insists that it shouldn't be more than 2,000 or 3,000. I ask you to take measures. And the measures were taken. Khrushchev was authorized to shoot more. The party meeting had been going on for 4 hours. The deputy chairman of the Vinnytsia District Executive Committee, Kozis, while sitting in the hall, felt that he could hardly keep his eyes open because of the monotonous speech. He tried to stay awake, but couldn't.
Враги хотели убить нашего родного товарища Сталина.
On hearing Comrade Stalin's name, the sleepy Kozis jumped up and began to clap loudly.
Я не хотел, товарищи, я не хотел.
The agents of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD, were behind him. They took away the spy and the enemy of the people. Khrushchev was informed about the incident. He ordered to find Kozis's secret accomplices, those who had worked or had dealt with him on personal or public matters, and to exterminate the hedge enemies, such as Kozis. 35,000 people were subjected to repression in Vinnytsia alone in 1938. Stalin was satisfied. In 1941, at the beginning of the war, he appointed Khrushchev as a member of the War Council as a sign of gratitude. Khrushchev couldn't believe it. Nikita Khrushchev was triumphant. But he didn't know what would later happen to him that would threaten not only his career, but also his life. (1943), Kuibyshev. The soldiers filled the hospital yard. Who were the most accurate shooters, aviators or sailors? They emptied a bottle of vodka. A sailor put the bottle on his head. A pilot took aim and shot. The sailor silently fell to the ground. Blood ran down his forehead. Leonid sobered up in a flash. One word ran through his head: tribunal. The news struck Khrushchev. His son Leonia must be executed, but he is so young. He hadn't done anything for his son. No warm words, nor any parental care. Tears choked Nikita Khrushchev. He had betrayed Frosya and didn't protect their son. But he can save him. He marched into the leader's office to explain. He looked at Stalin's eyes and realized that there was no hope. But Khrushchev knew what he had to do. He dropped down on his knees with a beatific smile and bitter tears and began to creep up to Stalin. The leader looked daggers at him.
Прости.
Товарищ Хрущев, идите воюйте.
He could barely stand. He was engulfed by a peculiar feeling of emptiness, just like something had burst inside him. Stalin apologized. Nothing else mattered. The most essential thing is that he managed to save Leonia. Now he could go to the front and come back a hero. And when the war is over, they will meet and he will make amends. Leonia will apologize to him. Stricken by grief, he sat in a shelter next to Major Zamorin, his son's comrade. Khrushchev couldn't believe what he was hearing. Leonia didn't return from the last flight operation. Nothing could be mended now. There is nobody to whom he could say the sincere parental words that he was holding back all these years. Leonid Khrushchev died a hero's death. Khrushchev couldn't even cry. There was a stabbing pain in his temples, and he couldn't breathe. A terrible thought flitted across his mind. Leonia was punished for the father's sins, for the shooting of innocent people, for arresting innocent families, and for making children orphans. And for what? Why did he kowtow to Stalin? To survive in the repression hell. But now he, Nikita, is still alive, and Leonia is dead. His son is dead, but Stalin is alive. He was determined to exterminate Stalin. While wearing the fool's mask, he will study the enemy's habits and wait for a suitable moment and strike. 1953. The Stalin's traditional dinner is in full swing. Last time, the gatherings were held every day, or more exactly, every night. They gathered at 11 in the evening and left just before dawn. They were all extremely tired with this regime. But Stalin, who was suffering from insomnia, wouldn't let his retinue go. Beria played the usual role of a toastmaster and forced the guests to eat and drink. Stalin himself didn't touch the food. He was suspicious of being poisoned. He saw enemies everywhere.
Ну что, товарищ, расстреляем Никиту или пусть танцует?
He danced. Everyone laughed at his clumsiness and didn't suspect what he was thinking of. He knew the time was close. He had to keep calm and kill Stalin.
Танцуй, Никита.
Best of all, by Beria's hands. I must consider everything carefully. I must remove Beria. Malenkov and Molotov don't have to be killed. It is enough to deprive them of their high office. He performed his last move, stepped forward and bowed. It began with the physician's case. Stalin received a denunciation. The Leningrad physician, Lydia Timoshuk, informed him that the group of court physicians is about to revolt. Their aim is to poison the devoted members of the Politburo and Comrade Stalin. The next day, the Soviet Special Services declared a hunt for miscreants wearing a white uniform. Khrushchev understood it was time. He convinced the suspicious Beria that Stalin must sign the order of his arrest. That would do the job. Then he could move aside and observe. Khrushchev saw Beria removing Stalin's entourage, and he replaced them with his devoted people. Firstly, the physicians, then the household servants, and lastly, the leader himself. He had prepared for him a terrible death, using a virulent poison made in the secret laboratory of NKVD.
Это не просто отравление. Отравление было, как говорится, по всем направлениям. Кровоизлияние было настолько страшным, что когда вскрыли желудок Сталина, то все было как будто посечено дробью. Как будто вот взяли в желудок внутри и выстрелили из дробовика. Все, вот такие кровяные пятнышки, такие кровоизлияния, все, желудок весь кровоизлияние, все, весь кишечник в кровоизлияниях. Все полностью, все, весь организм стал пропускать кровь.
Stalin's funeral was immortalized in this unique 1953 film footage. This is Lavrenti Beria. He is the first among the people carrying the leader's coffin. Nikita Khrushchev is just behind. He saw how confidently Lavrenti Pavlovich behaved, how he made the orders. Beria was sure that he was the successor, being unaware that the worst was still to come, and the full Khrushchev would strike the last blow. Beria didn't know that at the time Khrushchev had gathered his friends, Generals Zhukov-Batitsky and Moskalenko, under the veil of military maneuvers. He rounded up support from Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich. They burst into Beria's office and arrested him without explanation. The former chief of NKVD was executed at Lubyanka. Khrushchev became leader of the country. He combined the position of the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union with the position of chief of the Council of Ministers, having taken it from Malenkov. After that, he became the absolute authority. He was sure that he had taken vengeance and won a victory. And now, at last, everything would be okay. He hadn't realized that the fool's mask that he was wearing for years had become his true nature. The General Secretary's tragedy was that on his way to leadership, he was not learning how to lead the country, but how to be a fool. The reception on the occasion of the Soviet leader's visit to the United States of America was in full swing. All the American movie stars were there. Marilyn Monroe, Harry Copper, and Frank Sinatra. On the Soviet side, Nikita Khrushchev and his wife Nina Petrovna, and a few ambassadors. The delegation watched the new blockbuster Can-Can. And now Nikita Khrushchev commented in his usual manner about what he had watched. His indignation had no limits. Why did the actresses shamelessly kick their legs and show their underclothes? How could anyone like it? Just look at this. How? In order to make it more convincing, he pulled up his coat and danced something like a can-can. The Americans were shocked. They had never seen something like that before. Once again, he'd become the fool. Till the end, he accused Joseph Stalin, on whom he continued to take vengeance even after his death. October 1961, at 6 p.m., the militia blocked Red Square. And as night fell, the searchlights illuminated a plot behind the mausoleum where Stalin would be reburied. The grave was dug at 9 o'clock in the evening. And late into the night, the 8 officers carried Stalin's body out of the mausoleum and buried him near the Kremlin's wall. The next morning, only Lenin's body lay in the mausoleum. Stalin was not there. When, due to the Khrushchev's reformatory activities, the people in the USSR were on the brink of war, the former comrades of the General Secretary removed Khrushchev. Since then, he lived in the camp. His name disappeared from the pages of the great Soviet encyclopedia. 1971, the country celebrated the day of cosmonautics. The modest pensioner Nikita Khrushchev was watching again and again the famous frames. He remembered that day very well.
Вот они, покорители космоса.
Gagarin was advancing along a red carpet to report about the first human spaceflight. But something was missing in the picture. If one looked closely, he could see a little spot next to Gagarin. And it's not a faulty tape. That day, they were advancing side by side. two happy conquerors, the first cosmonaut and the first man of the best country in the world. Later, Khrushchev's picture disappeared even from the film negative. His face was erased in order to erase his name from the national remembrance forever.